Some minutes later, they get a call. And Daryl's going to tell you he drives back out to where he dropped him off, and he picks up Jonathan, and he picks up Portage Oliver. And they get in the back seat of the car. And there's some conversation. They didn't get in the house. They didn't get in the house because Richard Lowther is still up. It's like after 1 a.m., it's pushing 2 a.m. And Richard Lowther is still awake. The lights are all on, and they decide that they're not going to go in. Daryl's going to tell you that there was some talk about not doing this that night because they didn't have a way to get in. And Daryl's going to tell you that Jody Fetty then speaks up and volunteers to go knock on the door and pretend that their car broke down to get them in. And again, you're going to hear differing testimony. And Jody Fetty is going to tell you that that's not what happened, that she did not volunteer to do that. In any event, it was decided by the four in that vehicle that they were going to return to Richard Lowther's residence. That Jody Fetty was going to do just what I indicated to you, knock on his door, and when he answered, she was going to tell him that her vehicle broke down, and she asked to use his telephone. At that point, Portage Oliver and Jonathan Dukes were going to enter the residence and do what needed to be done. So they drive back out. Once again, Daryl turns on the Heron Road. He drops them off. This time, Jody Fetty does get out of the vehicle. And she goes with Jonathan Dukes here, and she goes with Portage Oliver. And they're going through the fields. If you noticed on your view of the scene, to the east of Richard Lowther's residence, there's sort of an old farmhouse, and there's an open field, again to the east of that. So they work their way through that field, these three. They get to Richard's residence. And they come in. Richard's residence is 2954 Temperance Road. The three of them, Jody Fetty, Jonathan Dukes here, Portage Oliver, come down through the field, and they come up behind Richard Lowther's house, and they entered through that open gate that you saw at the back of the fenced-in area of his yard. And they worked their way up through the yard, up to the corner of his residence, near that closed-in back porch area. Jody Fetty then comes around to this door, and she knocks on that door. Richard Lowther is sitting in his easy chair, sort of dozing off, watching Pirates of the Caribbean that night. We're now in the early morning hours of July 2nd of 2000. That's all he was doing. You'll hear that Richard Lowther is a retired gentleman, worked for a long, long time in maintenance at Kent State University. One of his loves is coin collecting. Among others, he was a hunter as well. Richard kept all hours of the day or night. Always had lights on, day or night. You're going to hear that. You're going to hear that Richard Lowther was a gentleman, he was a kind man, he was a generous man. And that night, he was all of those things. He heard that knock on his back door. It's probably somewhere in the area of 2 a.m. He got up and he answered the door. And there's a very short, 4'10", 4'11", blonde, white woman standing at his door. And she says to him, "My car broke down and I don't have a phone. Can I use your phone to call for help?" And Richard invites her in. And she comes through that porch door. And she enters those premises. and he escorts her through the next door into the residence, the living area of the residence itself. And he tells her the phone's right on the wall there in the kitchen. And you saw where the phone jack was, so you all know where we're talking about there. And Jody goes over to the phone, and she picks it up, and she starts punching numbers. She starts to dial that phone. And she dials random. But she gets something. Someone answers the phone. But she's talking and pretending that she's calling someone to assist her. In the meantime, Richard's dog, and you saw that dog when you were out there, same dog, starts barking excitedly. Richard makes a comment that there's probably a raccoon out there. So he goes out to investigate. And when he gets on that porch, he's viciously assaulted and attacked. Now, the state cannot specifically tell you what happened on that back porch. One of the reasons is that Jody Fetty says, as soon as Richard Lowther went out onto that porch, she dropped the phone, turned her back to that porch area where all those windows are, and went into the living room towards the door that exits the residence from the living room. She'll tell you she heard the threat, but she didn't see what happened. She didn't see who assaulted Richard Lowther. The evidence here is going to come in such a manner. It could have been Portage Oliver who assaulted Richard Lowther. But it also could have been Jonathan H. Luce who assaulted Richard Lowther. But what I will tell you, ladies and gentlemen, and you will learn, that based on the law, it doesn't matter whether it was Portage Oliver or Jonathan Dukes that assaulted Richard Lowther and injured him to the extent that those injuries approximately resulted in his death. It just doesn't matter. The state of Ohio does not have to show you specifically who laid hands on Richard Lowther or who injured him. It's not one of our burdens, and you'll see that and you'll hear that when the judge charges you with the law and when you look at the indictments. What we do know is this. We know as a result of that attack on that porch that Richard Lowther's spine in the area of his neck was fractured, and that was a displaced fracture, and that resulted in his spinal cord being injured and bruised. And as a result of that injury, Richard Lowther became paralyzed from about the middle of his chest down to his toes. He had no feet. And as a result of that, couldn't breathe on his own. His lungs couldn't function. His diaphragm couldn't work. Even though we don't know what happened on that porch, you're going to hear Richard Lowther in his own words tell you what happened on that porch. And he says that only one black male attacked him on